He bought a wife to fill the silence, but when she arrived with two frightened children, she refused to enter his home. Not until he swore an oath he'd never expected to make. "Your children will be mine too." The train hissed to a halt with a long metal groan, dust clouding around its wheels as the final car shuddered on the tracks. Tobias Brandt stood alone on the platform, hat in hand, boots planted firm in the dry dirt. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and weathered from a life that had known too many winters and not enough laughter. Folks in town called him the Ghost Rancher, not for any mystery, just the quiet way he moved through life, a man who spoke less than most men prayed, who kept to his land like it was the only place he'd ever belonged. Because it was. He had sent money, a letter, no promises of love, just honesty, shelter, and a life not lived alone. She had written back, said she had 2 children and nowhere left to go. If he would take them too, she would come. Now she stepped off the train with a paper bundle clutched in her arms and 2 small figures trailing close behind. The woman was tall, though not so tall as Tobias, and her frame showed the toll of survival, not fragile but worn, like something that had been mended too many times in places no one could see. Her dress was plain, her boots cracked, and her hair, once surely rich with color, was pulled back in a loose braid, streaked with the early grays of a life lived too hard and too fast. "Mr. Brandt?" she asked. Tobias nodded once. "Ma'am." She hesitated, then stepped forward. "My name's Miriam Hart. This here's Clara," she said, placing a hand on the shoulder of the older girl, maybe 10, with eyes sharp from fear and famine. "And this one's Toby." The boy beside her looked no older than 6. His clothes were too small. One sleeve was pinned where an arm was missing below the elbow. He stood half behind his mother's skirt, peeking out with a look that saw too much for a child his age. Tobias looked from one to the other. "I've got a wagon." He turned, started walking. They followed without a word, their footsteps crunching behind his in the grit. The wind picked up dust and tossed it sideways across the dry boards of the street. Children watched from windows. A man tipped his hat but said nothing. This was not a town where folks welcomed change, and a mail-order bride with 2 children was a kind of change people noticed. When they reached the wagon, Tobias helped lift the satchel she carried and motioned for her to sit up front. She hesitated again. He looked back at her. "Something wrong?" "No," she said. Then, "I just want to be clear. I came here for my children, not for me. I won't step foot on your land unless you promise they're yours now. Not out of pity, not as charity, as your own." Tobias stood quiet for a long beat. The wind tugged at the brim of his hat. His jaw worked, slow and thoughtful. "I didn't send for children," he said at last. "Then you sent for the wrong woman," she replied, voice even. Clara watched him, jaw set. The boy said nothing, only blinked with those heavy, hollow eyes. Tobias turned to them, looked hard, saw hunger, yes, but also something deeper. He didn't know what made him speak. Maybe it was the silence of his ranch getting too loud. Maybe it was the way the boy's one arm clutched at his sister's hand like he'd fall without it. Or maybe it was because Miriam didn't beg. She just waited. "Then they're mine," Tobias said at last, "if you'll come." She nodded, still her feet didn't move. "I need to hear it," she said. "Say it." Tobias glanced around. No one was watching now. Just sky and silence and a future not yet named. "Your children are mine now. In name, in home, in everything," he said. Only then did Miriam climb onto the wagon. Clara helped her brother up next. And for the first time in years, Tobias Brandt felt the first small shift in the world he thought would never change. They rode in silence for the first hour, wheels creaking beneath them as the sun pressed low in the sky. The trail to the ranch was long, dusty, and empty. No trees, no fences, just open land, wild and aching. The kind of place that didn't offer anything unless you took it from the ground yourself. At last the house came into view, a 2-story cabin built with thick beams and rough hands. No curtains, No paint, just function. It stood alone, distant from the barn and shed, a single crooked weather vane turning slow in the breeze. Tobias stopped the wagon. Miriam looked at the house, her expression unreadable. "Looks sturdy," she said finally. "It is." He climbed down, reached up to help her, but she stepped off on her own. Clara followed, carrying the bag. Toby stayed on the bench a moment longer before jumping down. Tobias walked to the front door. It groaned open as he pushed it, revealing the dim inside, the hearth, the table, the two chairs, a coat hanging from a single nail. He turned. Miriam hadn't moved. The children stood behind her. "I need to hear it again," she said, voice steady. Tobias met her eyes. "This is your home, yours and your children's. Everything here is yours now, not guests, not burdens, family." Only then did she take a single step forward. Toby looked up at her. "Mama," he whispered. She knelt and touched his cheek. "It's all right, baby, we're home now." And they crossed the threshold. Inside, the silence was not hollow, it was waiting. Tobias showed them the rooms upstairs, both of which had been cleaned recently. He pointed to the one across from his. "Yours," he said, "if you want it." "I'll sleep with the children for now," Miriam replied. Tobias nodded. "I'll start supper." The meal was beans and cornbread made without much thought for taste, but the children ate like it was gold. Miriam ate slower, watching Tobias as he moved. He wasn't graceful, but nothing about him seemed cruel. He didn't stare, didn't ask questions, just ate, then cleaned, then stoked the fire. That night Tobias sat outside on the porch, a lantern at his feet and a blade in hand, whittling a scrap of wood without shape. The stars above were clear. He didn't look up when the door creaked. "You always sit out here?" Miriam asked softly. "Not always," he said, "only when it's quiet." She stepped onto the porch, pulled her shawl tighter. "You meant it, didn't you?" she said after a while. "About them." "I don't lie," Tobias replied. "That's not what I asked." He turned then, looked her straight in the eyes. "Yes, I meant it." For a long moment they just stood there, strangers under a shared sky, and somehow the silence wasn't heavy. It was something else, something starting. But before they could speak again, a sound came from the barn, sharp, metal on wood. Tobias stood fast. Miriam stepped back. "You expecting someone?" she asked. "No." He grabbed the rifle by the door. "Mama," Toby called behind them, groggy. "Stay inside," she ordered quickly. Tobias moved toward the barn, steps fast but quiet. The door swung on its hinge. The animals inside were restless, one horse stamping, snorting. Tobias lifted the lantern high. Nothing. Just the wind pushing the open loft window, rope swaying from the rafters. But something was off. He could feel it. He didn't sleep that night. Sat by the window instead, watching the fields, listening. The children slept. Miriam did not. She stayed by their side, eyes wide open, listening too. Morning came slow and gray, dragging light across the fields in smudges of silver and ash. The storm that never came had left a tension in the air, like something had held its breath all night, and now exhaled through the brittle grass and creaking boards. Tobias stood on the porch long before the sun climbed high, arms folded, eyes scanning the tree line to the east where the hills bent down into shadow. Whatever had stirred the horses last night hadn't left tracks, but it had left a feeling, unwelcome and heavy. Inside, Miriam moved quietly through the kitchen, her hands working without sound as she stirred what little flour they had into something close to biscuits. Clara sat at the table, helping Toby lace the crooked buttons on his shirt. His small fingers fumbled, but she waited, patient, letting him try again. Tobias watched them for a long moment before stepping back into the house. "Coffee's hot," Miriam said without turning. "Thanks." He poured a cup, stood with it in both hands, leaning slightly against the counter. She didn't ask about the barn and he didn't bring it up. Not yet. I'll head to town today, Tobias said instead. We need more supplies, and I've got a wire to pick up. Miriam nodded. Do you want a list? Make one. Anything the children need, write it down. I'll get it. She paused her stirring. And what about you? He blinked. What about me? She turned then, not unkindly, but with something measured behind her eyes. Do you need anything, Mr. Brandt? He looked at her, really looked. At the faint purple under her eyes from too many nights spent listening for danger, at the threadbare hem of her blouse, at the way she carried her exhaustion like a shawl she couldn't shake off. And yet there was strength there. Not loud, not hard, just rooted. Don't reckon I do, he said finally, but thank you. He left after breakfast, hitching the wagon with practiced hands. Toby had wanted to come, but was easily distracted by the promise of helping Clara gather eggs. Tobias didn't miss the way the boy looked back at him when he rode off, a flicker of something too old for 6 years lingering in his eyes. The trail to town was long and quiet, and Tobias found himself thinking more than usual. He thought about the boy's missing arm and wondered how it had happened. He thought about Miriam standing on the porch in the dark, asking again if he meant it. He thought about the sound in the barn, the way the horses had moved like they knew something that hadn't touched ground yet. In town, the usual stares met him. Folks didn't say much to Tobias Brandt. They nodded, some tipped hats, some crossed the street. But when he walked into the general store with a list in hand and asked for thread, girls' stockings, and a blanket soft enough for a 6-year-old's skin, Mrs. Dobbs raised both eyebrows but said nothing. She knew better. Anything else? She asked. Wire office, need to check on something. Tobias made his way down the row of uneven planks to the telegraph station and handed over the stub he'd kept folded in his pocket. The man behind the desk, a thin fellow with more hair on his lip than his head, read it, squinted, then passed over a single folded slip of paper. Tobias unfolded it. She didn't tell you everything. I'm coming, eh? He stared at the paper a long time. Something wrong? The clerk asked. Tobias said nothing, folded the paper again, slipped it back into his pocket. He rode home slow, slower than before. His eyes moved constantly now, along the hills, the trees, the dips in the land where a man might crouch and watch. The weight of the message wasn't just in the words, but in the way it had arrived, unsigned, but signed all the same. A name Tobias hadn't heard in years but hadn't forgotten, and now he was coming. Back at the ranch, Miriam stood by the fence, watching Clara and Toby feed the chickens. The boy had a stick in hand and was gently drawing lines in the dirt, some quiet story playing out in his head. Clara watched the sky more than the birds, eyes narrow and restless. She was too old already, and Tobias hated the world that had made her that way. You were gone longer than I expected, Miriam said as he approached. I rode careful. She turned to him, eyes searching. Bad news. He hesitated. Could be. Miriam nodded once. I'm not afraid of bad news. I've lived in it too long to flinch now. Tobias handed her the small sack of supplies. He sent word, eh? Her breath hitched just barely. She didn't speak right away, just looked down at the ground. You didn't know? He asked. I didn't expect him to care enough to follow, she answered. But maybe I should have. He doesn't like losing what's his. Tobias didn't press. He didn't ask the question stacking up in his throat, not yet. That night the wind picked up again. The sky was empty of stars, clouded with something thick and low. Inside the house, Toby clung close to Clara as they lay on the mattress in the upstairs room. Miriam sat by the window, hands folded in her lap, watching the field. Tobias knocked once on the open door before stepping inside. He hurt you? He asked plainly. Miriam didn't move. Not the way you're thinking. He didn't hit, not with fists. But he could come here. He's the kind who won't knock. Tobias nodded. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You still want to stay? She turned then, Do you want us to? I wouldn't have said what I did if I didn't mean it. A silence passed, long and still, then Toby whimpered in his sleep. Clara murmured something and shifted, pulling him closer. They sleep better here than anywhere we've been, Miriam whispered, even with the danger. That's something. The days passed quiet, but the tension built like a thunderhead far off in the sky. Tobias taught Clara how to patch fencing, how to lift boards without breaking their edges. Toby helped where he could, always proud, never asking for help unless it was the one thing he couldn't do alone. Miriam worked like she'd lived there for years, tending the garden Tobias had abandoned, cleaning corners that hadn't seen light in ages, stitching quilts from old shirts. But every evening she'd glance at the road. Every night Tobias checked the barn before locking the doors. It was a Tuesday when the rider came. Tobias saw him from the ridge, a black dot against the horizon that grew slower than most travelers, deliberate, confident. He rode alone, but Tobias knew he wasn't alone in spirit. Men like A never traveled without the stink of threat on their skin. The horse was sleek, too fine for frontier land. The coat he wore was pressed. The rifle on his back was polished. Tobias didn't wait. He saddled his horse and rode out to meet him halfway. They met near the dry creek, silence between them like a canyon. Didn't think you'd come this far, Tobias said. A grinned, teeth too white, smile too wide. Didn't think you'd be dumb enough to take what's mine. She ain't yours, and neither are those children. A leaned forward on his saddle horn. She ever tell you about the fire, about how she ran? Took my niece and nephew with her. You think this is just some poor widow tale? I didn't ask, Tobias said. Didn't need to. A's eyes narrowed. You always were the type to get soft. You forget what we learned. Out here, soft gets you dead. Funny, I've been alive a lot longer since I stopped listening to you. The smile dropped. A straightened. I'll be back tomorrow and I won't be alone. Tobias nodded once, then don't expect a welcome. A turned his horse and rode back toward the hills, dust kicking up behind him. Tobias sat there a long time after the man vanished from view. He didn't shake, didn't rage. He just breathed deep and looked toward home. Toward the cabin with 2 sleeping children. Toward the woman who had asked him to say the words out loud, more than once. Toward the only thing in his life that didn't echo back. The porch creaked beneath Tobias's boots as he stepped up onto it, the weight of what was coming heavy on his shoulders. The sun had dipped behind the hills, bleeding its last light across the sky in streaks of rust and ash. He opened the door and stepped inside. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. He didn't hear laughter, didn't hear the soft shuffle of feet or the rustle of quilt or fabric. He only heard the crackle of the fire and the faint whistle of wind against the windows. Miriam stood in the kitchen. She didn't turn. She was rolling cloth between her hands, small, familiar movements that betrayed nerves more than anything else. I saw him, Tobias said. Miriam's shoulders stiffened, then slowly dropped. She turned. How close? Close enough to look me in the eye and lie. What'd he say? That you ran from him, that you took the children. I did. Tobias waited. Miriam looked down at the cloth, then laid it gently on the counter. Clara and Toby aren't mine by blood. My sister died 2 winters ago. Evan, didn't want them. Said he didn't have time for weaklings and broken things. I buried her with my own hands, took the children and left the next day. She looked up then, steady and unflinching. He called me a thief, said I'd regret it. I've been running ever since. Tobias nodded once. You don't have to run anymore. You don't know what he's capable of. I know what men like him are, and I've put worse men in the ground. She didn't flinch, but her eyes flickered. You've fought before. I've lived before, he said simply. That's all the fighting I need. They sat together after that, quiet and still, while the fire whispered between them. Upstairs, Clara read softly to Toby from a book Tobias had found in the barn, an old tale about a horse that never gave up, even when the storms came. Her voice was steady, calm, like she wanted him to believe it. When the children had gone to sleep, Miriam came back down and found Tobias still at the table, sharpening the knife he kept at his side. She leaned against the doorway and watched him for a long time. "You going to run?" "No. Even if it means blood." "I don't shoot unless I have to," Tobias said, "but I don't miss when I do." She stepped forward then, slow and unsure. "Why us?" she asked. "You could have waited, found someone easier, someone without this much baggage." He looked up, and for once, the silence in his eyes gave way to words. "Because I've lived in empty too long. I didn't know how heavy it was until you stepped down from that train and it shifted." Her breath caught. "I'm not saying I know how to love the right way," Tobias continued, "but I know how to protect, and if I'm gonna fight for something, might as well be something that matters." She didn't answer, just moved toward him, her hand brushing the back of his fingers for a single, fleeting moment before she turned away again. The next morning came brittle and cold. Tobias saddled the horse before sunrise, rode out along the edge of the ridge to scout the valley. The land rolled wide and open, no cover, no mercy. The wind was dry. The birds were gone. Something in the air had changed. By the time he returned, Miriam was already in the barn with Clara, tending to the goats. Toby sat on the fence, watching the horizon like a sentry. Tobias dismounted, tied the horse, and looked at the boy. "See anything?" "No," Toby said, "but I can feel something." Tobias didn't dismiss it. Children knew more than grown folks often gave them credit for. He found Clara in the barn with her sleeves rolled up, straw in her hair, scooping feed into rusted pans. She looked up when he approached. "You know how to shoot?" he asked. She shook her head. "Mama never let me." Tobias nodded. "I'll teach you today." Miriam stepped around the corner, hands on her hips, face unreadable. "She's 10, she said quietly. "So was I when someone taught me," Tobias replied. Miriam hesitated, then nodded once. "Teach her right, not just how to aim, teach her when not to." "I intend to." By midday, Tobias had set up bottles on a fence rail and handed Clara a small, well-oiled rifle. "It's not a toy," he said. "It kicks harder than you think, and if you're not holding it right, it'll bruise your shoulder and your pride." Clara listened, quiet and focused. Her hands trembled only a little. He showed her the stance, the sightline, the squeeze, not a pull, just a breath and a press. On the third try, she shattered a bottle. On the fifth, she hit the cap off one. She didn't smile. She just nodded and said, "Again." Tobias grinned. "That's the right attitude." They trained until the sun dipped low. Miriam watched from the porch, her hands wringing the hem of her apron. Toby sat beside her, drawing in the dust with a stick, pretending not to listen but hearing every word. That night Tobias reinforced the barn door, locked the windows, checked every round in his rifle 3 times over. He moved like a man preparing for a storm not made of weather. And then the knock came. It was just past midnight, one single hard pound. Then silence. Miriam sat up straight in bed. Tobias was already out of his chair, gun in hand, stepped soundless as he moved to the door. Another knock, slower, louder. He opened the door. 3 men stood there. Evan in the center, his face clean-shaven and smug, hands folded behind his back like he was there to deliver news instead of threats. Beside him stood 2 others, one tall and rail-thin with eyes that twitched like a snake ready to strike, the other wide in the shoulders, heavy in the gut, holding a shotgun with hands too comfortable. "You took something that don't belong to you," Evan said. "I didn't take anything," Tobias replied. "I gave them something you wouldn't." Evan stepped forward, boots crunching the dirt. "You always did think you were better than me. Even back in Kansas, when Pa gave you the horse and left me with the mule, I always wondered what made you special." "Nothing," Tobias said. "I just didn't waste what I had." Evan's smile curled. "Give them back, walk away, or this ends ugly." Tobias's rifle never wavered. "I told you, they're mine now. You come for them, you'd better be ready to bleed for it." Evan turned to his men. "You hear that? Man says he wants to play hero." The tall one chuckled. The heavy one shifted his grip. "I've buried men for less," Tobias said. "Then maybe it's time someone buried you." A voice called out from behind Tobias. "You try to touch my brother, I'll shoot you myself." Clara, standing at the top of the stairs, rifle in hand, eyes fierce and steady. Evan's eyes twitched. Well, look at that. The little girl thinks she's a soldier now." "I don't need to be a soldier," she said. "Just need to be enough to put a hole through a man who touches my family." Miriam appeared beside her, holding Toby in her arms. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Tobias stepped aside just enough to make room for what the word family looked like in full. Not blood, not name, just choice. "You've got till sunrise," Tobias said. "After that I won't wait for you to knock." Evan looked at them all. His face twisted once, something ugly passing through it. Then he spat into the dirt and turned. "Come on," he barked at his men. "Let's give them a night to think about how wrong they are." They disappeared into the darkness. Tobias closed the door. No one slept that night. Clara sat at the window with the rifle in her lap. Miriam kept Toby in her arms, rocking him gently even though his eyes never closed. Tobias paced, checked the locks, then sat in the chair by the hearth, eyes never leaving the door. By morning, the air was tight with expectation. The sun rose blood orange. They were coming. And the family Tobias hadn't known he needed was ready to stand with him. The light that broke across the valley came slow and muted, smothered beneath thick clouds that held no rain, but carried a tension Tobias felt deep in his ribs. It was the kind of morning that didn't whisper warning. It sat heavy, silent, watching. No birds, no breeze, just the slow stir of dawn over a land that knew violence like a forgotten hymn. Inside the cabin, no one had slept. Clara still sat by the window, her rifle cradled like it was part of her now. Her eyes were rimmed with shadows, but they never wandered. She stared at the trail as if willing it to stay empty. Toby was tucked beneath Miriam's shawl on the floor beside the hearth, though he hadn't shut his eyes since the knock. Every so often he blinked slow and whispered to himself, something soft, counting maybe, or praying. Miriam had made coffee hours earlier, but no one touched it. Tobias stood near the front door, arms crossed, back stiff. His rifle leaned against the wall, the revolver strapped at his side weighed heavier than usual. The clock ticked. The wind didn't blow, and still they waited. "They'll come at sunup," Tobias said quietly. Miriam didn't respond. She just looked down at Toby's face, then brushed his hair back with one trembling hand. "We're outnumbered," Clara said, her voice flat. Tobias nodded, "Likely." "Then how do we win?" He looked at her then, really looked, and something cracked just slightly behind his eyes. "We don't have to win," he said. "We just don't lose." Clara didn't flinch. "I can shoot, you know I can." "I know. And I will." "I know." Miriam stood slowly. "There's an old root cellar behind the barn," she said. "We could hide the children there." "No," Toby's voice cut in, small but firm. "I'm staying." "Toby." He turned to his mother, one hand clutching the worn hem of her skirt. "I'm staying. I'm not afraid of him anymore." Miriam's lips parted, but no words came. Tobias looked down at the boy. "Then you stay near me. You don't move unless I tell you. Understand?" Toby nodded once, jaw tight. The morning stretched thin. Tobias stepped onto the porch alone, scanned the horizon. The trail from the ridge was still empty, but he could feel it. He'd known men like Evan before, arrogant, cruel, and careful with their violence. They didn't come when you expected. They came when you blinked. He walked the perimeter one last time, checking the fencing lines. He'd wired a bell above the north corner near the trough, just a bit of scrap metal and twine, but it might give them a second's notice if someone came in low. The barn door had been reinforced. He'd moved the livestock deeper into the corral and braced the cabin windows with old shutters. Inside, he set the children on the floor with thick quilts and told them where to go if the worst happened. Clara listened without blinking. Toby stared at the fire, lips moving again in silent rhythm. Then at last it began. The sound of hooves, slow, deliberate, touched the ground like a warning bell. 3, 4, maybe 5 riders. Tobias stepped out and stood still, just beyond the porch. Miriam appeared behind him a moment later, shotgun in hand, calm as winter. Evan Crowley rode in at the center just as Tobias expected. He wore the same smug expression as before, the same pressed coat. But this time, he didn't bother hiding what he'd brought. Behind him, 2 more riders came into view. One held a rifle slung across his back. The other had a pistol already drawn. The third man, lean and narrow-eyed, dragged something behind his horse. At first, Tobias couldn't see it clearly. Then the light caught the edge of it, a long chain wrapped around the throat of a dead calf. A message, clear and foul. "Thought I'd give you a taste of what's coming," Evan called, pulling his horse to a stop just a few yards out. Tobias didn't move. "That's a good animal you wasted. Could have fed you on the trail back." "I'm not planning on going back," Evan said. Tobias felt Miriam shift beside him, not in fear but steadiness, preparedness. "You don't have a claim here," Tobias said. "You never did." "I have what I came for," Evan said, nodding toward the house. "Now you can give them back or we can take them. Either way, this ends today." Tobias's jaw worked slow and tight. "Then come on and try." For a moment nothing moved. Not the men, not the wind, not the horses. Then the first shot rang out. It wasn't from the porch. Clara, from the upstairs window, had seen one of the men start to circle left, creeping around the corral fence. She fired without hesitation. Her bullet cracked the silence, hitting the ground inches from the rider's horse. The animal reared, panicked, threw the man clean off. That broke the standoff. Suddenly there was chaos, shouts, gunfire, hooves slamming into dirt. Tobias pushed Miriam back toward the door. "Inside now." She didn't argue. He turned and fired at the man with the pistol. Missed. Fired again. This time the man screamed, falling sideways from his saddle. Evan ducked low, dismounted, and scrambled toward the barn. Clara shouted something Tobias couldn't hear. The shutters upstairs cracked open again, and she fired another round, this one hitting the edge of the fence near Evan's head. Inside, Miriam crouched low near the hearth, shielding Toby with her body. She had the shotgun ready, aimed at the door. Tobias took cover behind the water trough and fired again. Another rider dropped. 2 remained. One took off toward the barn. The other tried circling toward the cellar. Tobias cursed under his breath. He sprinted toward the back of the house, using the trees for cover. He caught the rider flanking toward the cellar just as the man raised his pistol toward the hatch door. Tobias didn't wait. He fired. The man fell face first into the dust. Only Evan remained. Tobias crept along the barn wall, heart hammering. He rounded the corner and there he was. Evan stood near the open barn doors, rifle raised, his eyes scanning for movement. "I'll burn this place," Evan hissed into the air. "You hear me? I'll burn it and salt the earth after." "You're not setting fire to anything," Tobias said, stepping out, gun aimed squarely. Evan spun, pulled the trigger, missed. Tobias didn't. The shot tore through Evan's shoulder, spinning him sideways. He hit the barn wall and slid down, clutching the wound. Tobias approached slow. The man groaned, gritting his teeth. "You don't get to crawl away from this," Tobias said. Evan spat blood. You think you're some kind of saint. You think taking them makes you better. No, Tobias said, but I'll tell you what does. Staying, showing up, and not leaving a little boy with one arm wondering why he ain't worth loving. He raised the rifle again. Evan went still. You going to kill me? No, Tobias said, that'd be too easy. He whistled loud. Clara appeared at the corner of the barn, rifle still in hand. Her eyes locked on Evan. Go get your mother, Tobias told her. Tell her it's over. She nodded once, then ran. When Miriam arrived, she stood in the barn doorway. Evan, pale and bleeding, looked up at her with something close to recognition. I ain't going to beg, he whispered. I know, she said softly. You never did. Then she stepped aside as the sheriff, summoned earlier by wire, rode in from the hill. 3 men followed him, rifles drawn. Tobias nodded to them. Got your man, he said. By sunset the bodies were gone. Evan was shackled and bleeding but alive, slumped in the back of the sheriff's wagon. As they drove away, he didn't look back. Inside the house the air was different, still quiet, still sober, but not tense, not heavy, just still. Tobias sat at the table, rubbing his hands, knuckles bruised. Miriam poured water into a basin and sat beside him, wiping the dust from his cheek with a rag. They didn't speak. Toby stood in the doorway, a bundle of blankets in his arms. I made your bed, he said. You look tired. Tobias smiled, faint and slow. Thank you, son. Miriam looked up. He said it without thinking. Son. And not a soul in the room corrected him. The sheriff's wagon was nothing but dust now, fading into the western trail with a broken man slumped in the back and justice clanging faintly in his shackles. Evening came soft and blue, the kind of quiet that usually followed death or birth, when the air was thick with meaning but no one quite dared speak it. The worst had come and gone. The land had seen blood, but not loss. And still the wind passed gently through the tall grass, as if testing what was left standing. Tobias sat on the back step of the cabin, elbows on his knees, face in his hands. He wasn't injured, just emptied. The kind of empty that comes after surviving something you weren't sure you could. He felt it before, after lightning storms that broke fence lines, after winters that took animals one by one, after burying his younger brother on the coldest day of 1871 with nothing but his own 2 hands. But this was different. This time he hadn't just come through something for himself. He stood between evil and someone else. The door behind him creaked, then shut. He didn't look up, but he felt her presence like a change in the weather. Miriam sat beside him, folding her skirt neatly beneath her. She didn't touch him, didn't speak, just sat, watching the orange of the sky melt into violet above the tree line. After a long silence, she spoke. I thought I'd feel safe. Tobias looked at her then, face unreadable. I thought once he was gone, I'd stop looking over my shoulder, she continued. But now it's like, I don't know who I am if I'm not running. Tobias took a long breath. Takes time. Your bones don't know it's over just because your mind says it is. She nodded slowly. Clara said she wants to plant something, a tree. What kind? She didn't say. They sat in silence again. Then Miriam looked over, her voice softer now. I heard what you said to Toby, called him son. Tobias didn't shift, didn't blink. I didn't plan it, he said. Didn't sound like you did. But I meant it. Miriam looked down at her hands. I wasn't expecting this, Tobias. I came here to survive, not to grow roots. Tobias finally turned to her. But they're growing anyway, aren't they? She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. That night Clara set the table without being asked. Toby folded napkins even if they didn't match. Tobias watched them, and a strange ache bloomed in his chest, like gratitude but heavier. Over dinner they didn't talk about Evan. They talked about what vegetables might grow in the dry patch near the fence, about chickens, about mending the tool shed. Clara asked if she could paint her room. Toby asked if goats liked music. Afterward, Tobias stepped out to check the barn again, out of habit more than anything else. He stood near the stall, running a hand down the neck of the old brown mare, when a sound from behind startled him. It was Clara. She held the rifle. "I cleaned it," she said, "like you taught me." He took it gently, inspected it, nodded. "You did good," he said. She hesitated. "Then can I keep learning?" "You want to?" "I don't want to feel helpless again." Tobias knelt to her level. "You weren't helpless, Clara, not once, but yes, you can keep learning. I'll teach you everything I know." She nodded once. Then, like it had taken every ounce of her courage, she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. It was brief, shy, but it struck him like a blow to the heart. When she pulled back, she said, "Thank you for not giving us back." He almost couldn't answer. "You're not something to be given," he finally said. "You're something to be chosen." The days that followed felt borrowed from another life. Tobias couldn't remember the last time he heard children laughing in his fields. Clara spent mornings reading and afternoons helping Miriam. Toby followed Tobias like a shadow, asking questions about tools, about clouds, about horses, about everything. It should have been exhausting, but somehow it was. Somehow it filled something in Tobias that had been hollow for years. Miriam, too, had changed. She moved through the cabin differently now, less like a guest, more like someone mending a home. She opened windows, rearranged furniture, baked when the flour allowed, sewed patches into clothes without being asked. But every now and then Tobias saw her stop, mid-motion, mid-word, and go still, as if remembering, as if checking to see if this piece was real. One evening, a week after Evan was taken away, Miriam stood in the small garden beside the cabin. The dirt was dry, but she worked it anyway, pulling weeds, turning soil, planting seeds from a paper envelope Clara had brought home. Tobias walked up quietly. "You picked a tree yet?" he asked. Miriam nodded toward a small sapling by the fence. "Pear tree," Clara said. "They're stubborn." "Good choice." They stood side by side in the quiet. "Did you mean it?" she asked suddenly. "Mean what?" "That this place is theirs, the children." "I meant every word I've said since the day you got off that train." She looked at him. "And what about me?" Tobias held her gaze. "You were never a question." She exhaled slowly, as if releasing something that had sat beneath her ribs for too long. That night Miriam came to his door. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She held his hand and they sat together on the edge of the bed, not touching beyond that, just breathing, just being still in a world that finally allowed it. She looked around his room, the worn shelf of books, the folded shirt on the chair, the old photograph of his brother in the frame by the lamp. "This house used to feel like walls," Tobias said. "Now it feels like a roof." Miriam smiled faintly. "That's the difference, isn't it? Walls keep things out, roofs hold things in." They stayed like that for a long while. Later, when she returned to her room and checked on the children, she found Toby already asleep, one arm flung wide, his chest rising slow and easy. Clara stirred when she entered. "He didn't have a nightmare," Clara whispered. Miriam sat on the edge of the bed. "Not tonight." "Not the last few." Miriam stroked her daughter's hair. "That's good." "Mama." "Yes." "Do you love him?" Miriam paused. "I think I could." Clara turned over and smiled into her pillow. "He loves us." Miriam didn't reply, but her throat tightened in a way that felt holy. The next morning brought laughter. Toby had let the chickens out early and was trying to herd them back with a broom, shouting commands like a tiny general. Clara laughed from the porch. Tobias leaned against the rail, arms crossed, watching the chaos with a grin that cracked through years of stillness. Miriam stepped out beside him. "You've got a smile," she teased. "I forgot," he said. "Didn't think I had one left." Later, Tobias took the children into town. Miriam stayed behind to rest, promising biscuits by supper. They rode in on the wagon together, Toby standing tall and Clara pretending to steer. In town, folks stared less. Some nodded. Mrs. Dobbs handed Clara a ribbon from behind the counter and refused to take payment. The blacksmith offered Toby a horseshoe to hang above the door. "You seem different," he told Tobias, "less haunted." Tobias smiled. "Maybe I stopped being alone." On the way home, as the sun fell behind the hills, Clara tugged Tobias's sleeve. "What does it mean when something broken still works?" she asked. He looked at her. "It means it's not broken where it counts." She nodded. "Then, that's what I think we are." Tobias didn't answer, but he reached across the wagon bench and pulled her clothes. By the time they reached the ranch, the sky had gone dark and soft. Lights flickered in the windows. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. It looked like home. Felt like it. As they approached, Miriam stepped onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands. "You're late," she called with a smile. Tobias grinned. "Your watch must be wrong." But then his smile faded. Miriam saw it too. The door was ajar behind her, just an inch. She hadn't left it that way. Tobias jumped from the wagon, his hand already on his revolver. "Stay back," he told the children. Miriam's face drained of color. "I didn't, Tobias, I swear I locked it." "I know," he said. He moved slow, rifle raised, approaching the door. Inside, the fire had gone low. A chair was overturned. One of the quilts lay on the floor, its edge torn. No sound. No movement. But someone had been here. And something was missing. The cabin was too still. Tobias stepped across the threshold like a man walking into an ambush. His boots fell silent on the floorboards as he scanned every shadow, every flickering corner lit by the dying hearth. The chair by the fire was tipped over. The edge of the rug bunched up like someone had stumbled. Beside it, small footprints, too small for boots, just damp outlines pressed into the wood, leading toward the back door. Tobias turned sharply. "Toby." Miriam gasped behind him. "He was with me. I tucked him in before starting the biscuits. He must have." "Clara," Tobias shouted, voice like gravel, "where's your brother?" The girl jumped from the wagon, sprinted toward the porch, braid bouncing wildly behind her. "He was here, I swear. He wanted to help with the butter." Tobias moved past them, following the trail. His heart pounded. This wasn't just a wandering child. The prints were scattered, uneven, like Toby had been pulled, forced. The back door hung open, swaying gently in the warm wind. Outside, the chicken coop was silent. Not a cluck, not a flutter. Tobias scanned the dirt, fresh boot prints, deep and deliberate, 2 pairs, one full-sized, the other a child S. A cold dread gripped his chest. "Miriam," he said low and sharp, "take Clara inside. Lock the doors, bar the windows, don't open for anything unless it's me." "But now." She didn't argue again. Her face was pale, jaw clenched. She grabbed Clara's wrist and pulled her back inside, the door shutting hard behind them. Tobias followed the tracks. They led north toward the tree line where shadows grew thick and the land dipped into a dry creek bed. He moved fast but quiet, every sense on fire, every nerve tuned to the possibility of sound. He'd expected danger from Evan, but Evan was gone, shackled, miles from here. This was something else. A mistake, maybe, a delayed threat, or a ghost from Miriam's past she hadn't yet spoken of. The boot prints curved toward the edge of the ridge, where the land dropped off steep. Tobias crouched low, eyes darting. Then he heard it. A whimper. Faint, like the last cry of a trapped animal. Tobias crept forward, hands steady on the rifle, ears tuned to every broken twig. Another whimper, closer now. He pushed past a thorn bush and froze. Toby was tied to a tree. Rope wrapped around his middle, arms bound behind him. His one good arm scraped raw from struggling. Tears streaked his dirt-smeared face, and a dirty cloth hung loose from his mouth where a gag had been sloppily tied. Beside him stood a man Tobias didn't recognize. Shorter than Tobias, with a wiry frame and long black hair that curled around his collar. He wore a patched coat and scuffed boots. A knife glinted in his hand, held casually, not in threat but habit. He was muttering to himself. "Boy wasn't supposed to see me," the man whispered. "Didn't mean no harm, just meant to get the mare, that's all, but he was there, staring, little freak." Tobias raised the rifle slowly, breath held. "Step away from him." The man jumped, spun, eyes wide. The knife dropped an inch. "Didn't mean nothing by it," he croaked. "Didn't know he belonged to someone." Tobias stepped closer, steady. "He belongs to me, now untie him." The man hesitated. "I won't tell you again." The stranger lowered the knife and reached behind Toby, fumbling with the rope. The boy sobbed now, not in fear, but in relief. His legs gave out as the rope fell. Tobias rushed forward, slinging the rifle over his back and catching the boy before he hit the ground. "You all right?" he whispered. Toby clung to him. "He said he'd cut me if I screamed." "You're safe, I've got you now." The man backed away, hands raised. "I wasn't gonna hurt him, I swear. I just needed the horse. I didn't know anyone was home." "You tied up a 6-year-old. I panicked." Tobias rose, keeping one arm around Toby. His voice dropped like thunder. "If I ever see your face again, you'll wish I'd only tied you to a tree." The man nodded wildly, stumbling backward into the brush, then turned and fled. Tobias didn't chase him. He knelt again, brushing the boy's hair back. "You did good, son, real good." Toby's chin quivered. "I tried not to cry." "You were brave, that's all that matters." They walked back slowly. Tobias carried him most of the way. By the time the cabin came into view, Miriam was already on the porch, shotgun gripped in both hands, Clara peering through the window. When she saw them, she dropped the gun and ran. Toby was in her arms before Tobias could speak. She kissed his head over and over, whispering prayers of thanks, her body shaking from the fear she'd refused to show before. Tobias stood back, giving her that moment. Clara joined him, eyes wide. "What happened?" "Someone tried to steal a horse," Tobias said. "Found more than he bargained for." "You should have killed him." Tobias looked at her. "Maybe, but I didn't need to." That night no one slept early. Miriam kept Toby close, wiping his scrapes with care and singing softly under her breath, an old lullaby that made Tobias's chest ache without knowing why. Clara sat beside her brother, holding his hand, fierce and silent. When they finally did sleep, it was all together, blankets spread on the floor near the hearth, arms entwined, like they knew safety better when they could feel it breathing beside them. Tobias sat in his chair long after, staring at the fire. His hands were steady, but something inside him stirred, an old wound reopening. He knew the type of man who struck at the edges, who tested fences, who waited until peace softened a man's vigilance. He'd been foolish to think it was over. In the morning, Tobias packed the rifle and the revolver, strapped both across his back. "Where are you going?" Miriam asked. "Sheriff," he said, "needs to know someone is still creeping around the land. Can't risk another scare like that." "I'll go with you." He shook his head. "You stay, keep them safe." "I'm not letting you walk out of here alone." "You're not letting me do anything," he said, not unkindly. "You're trusting me to come back." Miriam met his eyes. "Then you'd better." He leaned in and pressed a kiss to her forehead. She froze at first, then leaned into it. "I'll be back before sundown." The ride to town was long and solitary. Tobias didn't like leaving them, but the man had to be reported. If he didn't, more might come. The sheriff took the report without fuss. "Sounds like Willard Kane," he muttered. "Was a stable boy up near Dead Elm, got thrown out for pocketing coins and riding horses at night. He's been skulking around the hills for years now, harmless mostly, but mean when cornered." "He tied a child to a tree," Tobias said flatly. The sheriff sobered. "Then he ain't harmless anymore." "I don't want him jailed," Tobias said. "I want him warned, and if he sets foot near my land again, he won't be walking off it." The sheriff nodded, understood. On the ride back, Tobias took the long way. He thought about the family he hadn't meant to build, about the promises he hadn't expected to make, about the boy who hadn't cried and the girl who aimed a rifle like she was born to protect. He reached the ridge just as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the land gold. His cabin stood in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney, the outline of Miriam on the porch. Clara ran out first when she saw him, then Toby, then Miriam. He climbed down, caught the boy in his arms, lifted Clara into the air. Miriam stood back, arms crossed, smile gentle. "I told you I'd come back," Tobias said. "I was starting to believe you." She stepped forward. He reached for her hand. "Miriam." She looked up. "I didn't buy a wife." Her brow furrowed. "I bought a chance," Tobias said. "Didn't know it then, but that's what it was. A chance at something real, something that don't fade when the sun goes down." She swallowed hard. "You saying you want more than just a roof partner?" "I'm saying I want all of it. You, the children, this life. Not because I'm lonely anymore, but because I'm not." She didn't say anything, just leaned forward and kissed him, slow and certain. Inside, the fire crackled. Outside, the wind blew steady. And in the space between them all, something new took root, not survival, not obligation, but family. The days that followed passed not in a blur, but in something more deliberate, measured, like footsteps over freshly laid stone. Nothing was rushed. Every moment carved itself into the fabric of their new life with care, as if the land itself was watching and approving. The morning after Tobias returned from town, the sky opened in a warm spring rain, not the kind that came to destroy, but the kind that made things grow. The garden that Miriam had started bloomed faster than it should have. The pear sapling Clara had planted showed its first leaves. The chickens laid more eggs than usual. Even the old mare moved with something like youth in her joints. The house changed too. Tobias added a second shelf in Clara's room for the books she'd taken to collecting. Miriam cleared out the corner pantry and turned it into a small sewing nook, patching clothes while humming a tune from her childhood. Toby, emboldened now, followed Tobias to the barn every morning, insisting he could handle the hay fork even though it was twice his size. One evening they all sat around the dinner table. It wasn't a holiday, no one's birthday, just supper, yet the moment felt like something worth keeping. Miriam passed slices of bread around, warm from the hearth. Clara read a line from one of her books. Toby interrupted with a question about stars, and Tobias answered without hesitation, pointing to the ceiling as if the sky were just above the rafters. When Miriam looked around the table, she saw something that caught in her throat. Not survival, not safety, but peace. "Thank you," she said suddenly. The room quieted, all eyes turned to her. "For what?" Tobias asked. "For letting us belong." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached across the table and took her hand. "You belonged the moment you knocked." Outside, thunder grumbled low in the distance. Not a threat, just a reminder that the world kept moving. But not everything was meant to stay quiet. 3 days later, a writer came into town asking about Tobias Brandt. He wasn't loud, he wasn't violent, but he had a face no one recognized and a voice that didn't match his clothes. The sheriff, cautious now after the Evan incident, rode out to the Brandt ranch himself. Tobias met him at the gate. "What's this about?" Stranger asking questions. Said he was from a mining camp south of here. Name of McCree. Tobias frowned. Don't know the name. Didn't think so, but he was looking for someone named Miriam. The name hit like a stone in the gut. Tobias didn't show it. Did he say why? Only that he'd come a long way. Said he had news. What kind of news? The sheriff shook his head. Didn't say, but I figured you should hear it before anyone else did. Tobias nodded slow. Thanks. He walked back to the cabin, with the sheriff's words echoing in his ears. Inside, Miriam was shelling peas into a wooden bowl, sunlight streaking through the window behind her. Someone came looking for you, Tobias said quietly. She looked up, stilling. Who? McCree says he's from the south, a mining camp. Sheriff says he has news. The bowl slid from her lap, peas scattering across the floor. She stood slowly. No one should know I'm here. Do you know him? Her voice was barely above a whisper. There was a man, years ago. He worked with my father. They ran a claim together, but there was a cave-in. I was only 17. I thought he died. You think it's him? I don't know. Tobias crossed the room. We don't have to see him. We can send word. No, she said, stronger now. If someone's coming from that life, I want to hear it. I want to know what's left of it. So they agreed. Tobias rode into town the next morning while Miriam stayed behind. Clara and Toby kept close to her all day, sensing something in the air had shifted again. The man named McCree stood outside the saloon when Tobias arrived. He was middle-aged, with a limp in his left leg and a scar across his jaw. His coat was fine, but his boots were worn. A contradiction, like a man who once had money and now only had memories of it. You Tobias Brandt? He asked. I am. Name S. Eli McCree. Tobias stiffened at the name, not from fear, from memory. I'm here about Miriam. What about her? McCree's eyes softened. I owe her an apology, one I should have made years ago. Tobias didn't speak. McCree continued. Back when her father died, I was working claims with him. After the cave-in, she was told we'd all been buried, but I made it out. Got my leg crushed, but I lived. Problem was, her father didn't, and I didn't know how to tell her. You ran. I left, thought it'd be better if she believed we were all gone, but she deserved more than that. I got a letter a year ago, said she'd gone west, said she had 2 children in her care. Tobias's eyes narrowed. That wasn't public knowledge. McCree reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. It was from Evan Crowley, said he had something I might want, and that he'd trade her for gold. Tobias took the letter. Read it. It was real. I didn't come to collect, McCree said. I came to protect. Evan was a vulture, and I knew if he'd found her, someone needed to stand between him and whatever he planned to do. You're late, Tobias said. I know. Tobias folded the letter, tucked it into his coat. Come with me. She'll want to hear it herself. The ride back was slow. McCree didn't speak much. Tobias didn't offer him conversation. When they arrived, Clara and Toby were already waiting on the porch. McCree looked at them, something like guilt twisting his face. Miriam stepped outside, her eyes locked on the man. For a moment she didn't move. Then she stepped down the steps and walked to him. Eli, she said quietly. He took his hat off. I'm sorry, Miriam. She studied him. Why now? I ran too long. Thought maybe I could fix something before it was too late. Miriam nodded once, then turned to Tobias. He stays one night, no longer. Tobias agreed. That evening, McCree sat at the dinner table with them. He didn't speak much. He watched Toby and Clara with something like reverence. I should have helped, he said suddenly. I should have taken them in when your sister died. Miriam didn't respond. I can't undo that, But if you ever need anything, land, money, names, I've got a few left." "You can't buy back time," she said gently, "but you can stop running." McCree left at dawn. Tobias watched him go from the porch. Miriam stood beside him. "You believe him?" he asked. "I believe he's trying." "That enough for you?" She took his hand. "It is now." Weeks passed. The pear tree grew taller. Clara painted the inside of the cabin with wildflowers in tiny brushstrokes. Toby learned to tie his boots one-handed. Tobias rebuilt the barn wall, then added a room to the cabin. Not for guests, but for family. Miriam planted marigolds along the fence. She baked more, laughed more. One afternoon, she stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, and called to Tobias in the field. "I figured I'd wait until the rain stopped. It's been dry 3 days." He walked to her, dirt on his hands, sweat on his brow. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a silver ring, simple, smooth, polished. "Would you be my wife, Miriam Hart?" She took the ring, slid it on. "No," she said. "Your children will be mine too." Miriam pressed her forehead to his and closed her eyes. "They always were," she whispered. In the distance, the wind stirred the grass. The pear tree swayed gently in the night. And inside a cabin built by solitude, then reborn by love, a family slept beneath a roof that no longer echoed. Because in that place, forgotten things were remembered. Broken things were mended. And no child ever knocked on that door again without it opening wide.